the election. When I first ran, you only had to report 30 days after the election. Well, what good did that do anybody to find out who was being funded by what after the election? So my amendment required a 10-day prior disclosure, and you would have thought I was shaking the foundations of the Capitol building. But it passed, it became law, and it's the law today. I just signed the American Anti-Corruption Act. It's model legislation that would do a lot to reform our federal elections. It would ban lobbyists from giving to candidates, ban lobbyists from bundling checks, stop the revolving door where elected officials and high appointed officials leave immediately to go lobby. It would require immediate disclosure of campaign donations online. We've got the technology to do that. It would prohibit the dark money that Madeline has eloquently criticized. And it would have a public financing as part of that process, and it would require open primaries. I forget the number. I think about 20 states have open primaries. I'm not sure of that. We're a closed primary state. It's unfair. I tried to change that when I was a state rep. The politicians that get elected under the current system don't like to change it. And it requires a lot of fight to change anything that got them there in the first place. But I'm willing to make that fight.
Hi. One of the difficulties in a primary as opposed to a general election is finding out how the three of you differentiate on certain policies. So I'll take a stab at one, and if you are like-minded on that, if any of you could also talk about a particular policy where you differ from the other candidates, so we can see that. But I think to that end, I would like to look at healthcare, and obviously we're in kind of an unusual situation now where Obamacare is the law of the land, but the Republicans are doing everything they can to sabotage it. So my question would be, if you got into Congress, would you be looking to bolster Obamacare, or any of you for single payer, or any other solutions that you might have?
Great question. I am for Medicare for all, or some single payer system. I think Medicare for all is the way to go. In the meantime, I want to restore the subsidies to Obamacare that Trump has cut. I think that's job one, because middle income people are going to get screwed as those subsidies go away. They've got to buy on the open marketplace, got to buy their insurance, and the federal money won't be there. I would suggest that my experience in Washington is an advantage for me in this race. I will be able to hit the ground running due to my time there, my experience, my knowledge of politics, my relationships with the leadership that are in place in Washington. And I think that's an advantage to me. And another issue I think distinguishes us, I believe very strongly, even as a liberal, progressive Democrat who wants to spend money on important things like public education and environmental protection and the rest, that we must balance the budget. It's essential. We won't have any money to spend on our progressive ideas if the budget is out of balance. We're going deeper into debt. And both parties have been unbelievably reckless and irresponsible in Washington regarding fiscal matters. We've got to reverse the Trump tax cut to the wealthy and corporate America, and frankly seek other sources of revenues if we're going to have a truly compassionate and progressive national government.
Yeah, I think just because I've been hanging out with these guys for a little bit, you're going to be a little disappointed because I agree with Joe, and I think Matt's going to agree as well. And we all think that healthcare is one of the top issues, and have all talked about single payer, Medicare for all. One of the things I've talked about a little bit is Medicare Extra for all, which is a phase-in so that people can keep the plans they like. But people shouldn't have to be making these choices. Can they afford their drugs? Can you go to an extra physical therapy appointment? We need to solve this, and balancing the budget's important. I'll be honest with you, we agree about a lot of things. I think it's about who you want to see representing you in Washington now. What is the voices you want to raise up? I've been not an elected official, so I haven't been part of the gridlock in Harrisburg and Washington. I've been part of an advocacy group fighting for issues that I care about, working with people on both sides of the aisle, working with people across the state to build coalitions. So it's just a different experience. It's a different, different path to leadership that I think is important. something that I care about that we haven't talked that much about on the trail, so I can't say where the others are, so maybe we'll get some disagreement. I feel very important about what's going on in the Middle East and the relationship between Israel and the United States, and that should be a strong relationship, and that we need to support democracies, and that we need to protect both the United States and Israel and our friends, and that an America First policy has never worked for America or anybody else, and we need to be challenging that we still need to keep our leadership, that drawing ourselves inward, blocking people from coming has never worked for this country. Our country is built on being a leader, bringing people in, raising up, bringing us together, and I think we need to keep doing that.
I'm going to let you in on a little secret. This is an awkward primary because we all know one another. We've all worked with one another. I got my start in politics working on a Joe Hoffel case. He gets the credit for my husband and I meeting, having 3 grown sons, the whole bit. So this is really awkward. Sheer and I work together continually on the issue of gun violence. So we're not going to have huge differences, I think, among us on the issues. We're progressives. We care deeply about these issues. What I think I offer, what distinguishes me, is my experience. I am an elected. I chose to get into public service in my 50s because I knew that I wanted to do something for others. And I thought I could use my skills as a lawyer, as a teacher, as a mom, as a grandmom to bring the fight to Harrisburg. And now I want to take that same fight to Washington. And what have I done? I've been a disruptor. I've called out when we won't tax shale, for example. As a freshman, I introduced a shale tax bill to the chagrin of others, saying you really shouldn't do that. I spoke on the floor of the House shortly after I was elected. The Speaker of the House literally came to me separately and said, "Freshmen don't speak on the floor of the House." I said, I did not get that memo. I'm elected to serve. I don't know if I'll get to be a sophomore. I'm going to speak. So I think what I hope you'll see is that I am passionate. I bring my current legislative 6 years of experience that I'll take right to Washington and fight for the values that we care about, like protecting our children, like their safety when they are walking the streets or in their schools. I'll take that fight to Washington.
So something that I've noticed is that there's a lot of hate thrown around, and it's like Democrats and Republicans are constantly head-to-head on everything, and somebody's always right and somebody's always wrong. But that really that makes everything ineffective. Like, how can something get done if it's always going to be about the other party and, like, the other party's wrong? I think, like, I'm just wondering, like, what's the plan? Like, you're going to have to work, Democrats and Republicans are going to have to work side by side. So what's the plan to work with those people and to get something done?
I think that's a great question. Here's the thing. Your representatives in Harrisburg and Washington will say, you know, they may hold town halls for actually people who are already in Congress, and they'll say, that's really complicated, that's really hard, it's really hard. Guess what? We're all up here running because we want to go do hard work. If you're not up for the job, then you should be replaced. It is hard. It is easy to go black and white, left and right, and divide. The people who used to cross those aisles, they're retiring, they're resigning, they're leaving because they're not getting the same respect and partnership they used to have. I want to be able to do that. I don't want to go to Washington for my resume or because it sounds like it's going to be a good job. I want to go and get stuff done. The work that I've done for years, anti-discrimination, better courts, equal access to justice, gun safety. That's why I want to go. I want to do that work. I want to be challenged to it. I hope if I come back to a town hall and you say, Shira, you know, what have you gotten done? I'll be able to tell you that I've passed bills with people across the aisle, that I've met with other people. We can't just blame it on being in the minority. We have a responsibility too. And, you know, I hope that our party will take the majority, and then you really should hold the majority accountable. But we need to be more than a loyal opposition. We need to be more than gridlock, I think.
Well, thank you. We do need politicians willing to compromise. That is for sure, and work across the aisle. I've done that twice in Montgomery County as a commissioner, 2 different stints. I worked with one of the Republicans who couldn't get along with the other Republican when I was the minority Democratic commissioner. and formed bipartisan governing coalitions. In fact, the last time I did that, I partnered with Jim Matthews, leaving Bruce Castor in the cold, where he deserved to be. And we were both denounced by our party leaders for doing it. Jim Matthews was actually censored by an official vote of the Montgomery County Republican Committee because he did a bipartisan coalition to govern Montgomery County with a Democrat. So I know how to do that, and again, when I get to Washington, I will look for ways, hopefully we're in the majority, but either way, look for ways to get things done in Congress by legalizing the Dreamers, by restoring health care subsidies for Obamacare, for requiring the drug companies to bargain and negotiate with Medicare to lower prescription costs for seniors, raising the minimum wage, $15. Fight for things that have bipartisan support and get things done no matter what the president's doing. I'm very happy to fight with Donald Trump because he deserves opposition, but legislators need to legislate, and I know how to do that across the party line whenever possible.
I think your question is great, and I don't want you to be utterly discouraged. People in elective office do try to work across the aisle, whether it's the issue of health care for all, which I absolutely support. When Obamacare was passed, for example, governors had the choice whether to opt into the expansion of Medicaid. Our governor, former governor, Corbett, would not do that. I worked across the aisle with Gene DiGirolamo and others, the Republican representatives, to bring that to the fore, to fight that we expand Medicaid. And when Governor Wolf, thankfully, was elected, he immediately did that. But it was a bipartisan chorus of people saying it is the right thing to do to bring health care to more and more Pennsylvanians. And just so you know, with that expansion, people got coverage for mental health treatment. People got coverage for addiction, critically important, hundreds of thousands of people. That was a bipartisan push. The other thing that I have recognized as a Democrat, deeply in the minority in a Pennsylvania House, I give up pride of authorship of legislation. If the legislation is worthy, it doesn't have to have mine as the lead name if my lead name is not going to move the legislation. So I partner with people on the background check bill. I'm not the lead name on that as much as I'd love to own that. But it doesn't matter if it has my name as the lead. A Republican has the lead on that. That's, I think, a strategic way of signaling, I want to solve problems. I want to work across the aisle. I'm sure we have more in common than we do apart, and I really believe this moment is happening. And in a bipartisan way, I believe we'll get some justice on many of the issues that we're talking about, whether it's in Harrisburg or in Washington, D.C.
We have an immoral president and a complicit House and Senate. And I don't hear many people, Corker's one, McCain is one, speaking up. And what I'd like to know is, if either of you were a representative, would you be willing to actually be on television, talk to reporters in the hallway, and get your face and name on television, calling out all this bad stuff that's going on? There's no one that I know of in the House, except those few people, who say anything. Congress, there's tendency to be mute. And I think people in the House and people in the Senate, you guys are running for the House, ought to say something, take a stand. A stand not on Twitter, not on your website, a stand out there where we can all see you.
I thank you for that question, and I think one of the most compelling reasons to run for public office, to run for Congress at this time, has to do with the chaos, the disorder, and the disruption, the disregard for ethics, the disregard for our institutions of government, the disregard for the rule of law, and the utter disregard of truth and ethics. So to your question, you bet. And I do the same thing in Harrisburg. I don't mind calling out that which is terribly wrong. I think the only thing that we have to do is make sure we don't mimic the kind of language we're hearing out of the president and others around him, the kind of rhetoric that hurts other people, that shows no regard for the truth. I used to teach writing and rhetoric at LaSalle University with Dr. Sullivan here. I really always told my students, first of all, gather the facts, and then gather your ability to argue those facts. That's what I promised to do. I'm already doing it as a state legislator, and I will definitely stand up. It's my calling. I feel a moral obligation to stand up and in a truthful way call out that which is so very, very gravely wrong.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and that's one of the main reasons I'm running. Look, I have gotten up and spoken against the gun lobby, spoken against people who have disagreed with us. The only thing that's ever given me pause is, are they gonna get my personal address? It's out there now. I'm getting personal surveys from the NRA, Firearm Owners Against Crime, at my personal address. I have a different last name than my family. That's out there. That's the one thing that gave me pause, because I am a hated figure among some of those gun lobby groups here. But I'm not afraid to stand up. And that's the reason I went to law school years ago, to work for the issues I care about, to stand up for the people who don't always have their own voice. So I want to do that. That's our responsibility. I'm so frustrated that people aren't calling out this president, that the Republicans are complicit, that they're so happy to have all the branches of government. They're selling their souls, really, to the devil. So I will, and if I don't do it, you let me know. But I'm not afraid, and if it means that I don't get reelected, well, that's what it'll mean. But I need to be able to sleep at night. I need to be able to hold up my head to my kids and say, I did what I thought was right. I did the right thing. I did what I believed in. That's what I've always done, and that's what I promise you I'll do.
With all due respect to the question, I think it's pretty safe to assume all three of us would be delighted to be on television every day. And criticizing President Trump would be a pretty good subject to hold forth upon. Shira mentioned I'm in this race because of Donald Trump. My wife told me to stop yelling at the television and get back into it, and here I am. He lies, he divides, he's a horrible president. And I'm just as angry at the incompetent and dysfunctional Congress, which is really the fault of both parties. So we need big changes in Washington, and I'm very happy and willing to call for that every single opportunity I have. If the Mueller report contains what I think it's going to contain, I'll vote to impeach him. If the Mueller report is not clear on that, it may require us to wait to the 2020 election. There's something to be said for defeating him in 2020 rather than impeaching him. He'll never accept impeachment. It'll be a rigged deal, fake news. He'll go down as a martyr. There's nothing better than defeating him 2-1, 3-1 in the 2020 general election. That would drive a stake through the heart of Trumpism, which is what I'd like to do.
Hi, my question is about the demilitarization of the police, which relates certainly to gun safety, safety in the streets. Is there anything that you all see that you could do in Congress to help de-escalate the way our police departments have become like armies?
That is a direct result of 9/11. I was in Congress in 9/11, and we just turned around and spent a lot more money on the Defense Department, and we created the Department of Homeland Security, and we began to send all kinds of military equipment to police around the country in the name of Homeland Security. There was good reason for that at the time. I think the pendulum has gone too far, and Congress, I believe, can pull that back, not just in funding and sending of equipment, but in trying to right the balance. Now, we still live in a very dangerous world, God knows, and our national security people have done an amazingly good job because, knock on wood, there hasn't been another 9/11 from outside our shores. Now, of course, we've got gun terrorism that plagues us and that brings us together here today. But I think that pendulum went too far, and I think Congress has a role to play in getting it back.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a few things. One is, can regulate the Army surplus things that are sold to local police at such cheap prices. And that's part of the reason they have these tools and these weaponry that they didn't used to have. They also, you will hear, well, the police are outgunned. That's sometimes true, but we can deal with that with some of the gun laws as well. The other thing isn't just the hardware, it's the training, right? Implicit bias, how do you react? We know that even the most highly trained people are not always able to react as you would want them to in that moment. So both physically, they don't always hit their targets, and emotionally, and how they react and what they see that's not there and what is there. So we need that kind of training by real experts over and over again, not one time in the academy, but annually, biannually, for all of our police departments, confronting what that bias is. Why do black men in cars get stopped differently than white men? Why? Every time. I have young men growing up in my house. I don't have that same conversation with them that parents of young black men are having. That's not right. We all know that. We need to train our police that way so that we're not training our kids that way. So I think it's both the hardware, but it's the software. It's what is with the people. We're now defunding the Justice Department. All the investigations they've done about local police departments, things that made Philadelphia better, being undone. Again, we have a Justice Department that doesn't really define justice the way I do. So I think those are things we have to look at. I think Congress does have a role to play in all those things.
Like my colleagues, I too would want to de-escalate the militarization of our police. It is absolutely the wrong direction to go. It is definitely interconnected with the issue of gun violence. How do we react that more and more weapons are on the street, more and more illegal guns are on the street, more powerful weapons are on the street? So in part it's Homeland Security, but in part it's just security. Just a fear that there's just too much gun violence. We have to turn that all the way back. And along with legislation to actually save lives, which we can pass and would make a difference, we have to focus on the other end of it, which is education. The more we educate our citizenry, the less we're going to need that kind of militarized extreme. So we really have to go back to that. Educate kids at the level that everyone deserves, not by way of your zip code, not by way of your wealth, not by way of what did your parents have or not have. Educate our children and we will grow ourselves out of this use of militarization. Because we'll educate them to be like these young people, they will run for office, they'll get these things right.
Is it good? Okay. Something that many politicians have proposed in an attempt to prevent school shootings is arming teachers and having armed security on campus. As a student, I can tell you a majority of my classmates, fellow students throughout the country, and teachers find that horrifying, especially students of color that have to deal with the fear of police brutality daily outside of school. So I was wondering each candidate's opinion on bringing this armed security into schools, and if you do support it, I would like if you could elaborate on your reasoning.
I have a feeling we're going to be the same on this. It's insane. The notion that you would arm a teacher, and I say this as a grandmother of a 6-year-old granddaughter who's in kindergarten. The last thing I would want to see is a teacher having a gun in that setting. It makes as I say, the words fail me. It's insane. I almost wish that there'd be some awful video game that we could show Donald Trump and the leaders of the NRA or whomever tries to talk about this, to show them the madness of it, what would possibly and definitely go wrong. So I'm utterly opposed to it. As I said in the Pennsylvania Senate, they passed it a year ago. Insanity. I'll fight and speak against it. We will fight it. The governor will veto it. At the federal level, we'll shine a light on the madness that is.
Yeah, so I think there's two questions. One is the arming teachers and one is armed security. So in terms of arming teachers, this does not work. Nobody thinks it is a good idea. Teachers, principals, parents, students, police officers, nobody thinks it's a good idea. We got that Senate vote last year. It was 22 to 18. That's a win. When the governor vetoes it, it will not be overridden. We got Republicans and Democrats on both sides to vote no. Hopefully it'll be more people if it goes to the House, but that's some ways that you stop bills. Nothing has happened on that bill in over a year. So we can win on that. And the thing that was most important to me is my organization, Ceasefire PA, does a program in Pittsburgh where we're in the schools teaching advocacy. And one of the students said, I would not feel safe in my school if teachers had guns. It would totally change the learning environment. And I think that's something that the grown-ups don't always talk about, right? We talk about, the teacher might leave the gun unsecured, there could be accidents, you've now introduced a gun in, but how do the kids feel from learning from a math teacher who is packing, or it's in the closet? I think that's really important that you brought that up. In terms of security guards, trained people, this is I think a local issue for school districts and principals and school board members and parents and students to talk about. For some schools, it makes sense to have an armed security guard. For some, it doesn't. And one of the reasons that this bill in Harrisburg moved as far as it did was because Senator White from out in Indiana County, he said that his schools were miles from a police station. It took, it would take 15 minutes for the police or sheriff to get there. But instead of wanting to have a retired police officer trained to be a security guard or something like that, he wanted to arm the math teacher. So I think we need to talk about it differently. Somebody whose job is to teach students, who already is so under-resourced, who is buying their own books for their kids, who has so many other things that they're doing, classroom maintenance, the classrooms are too full, should not be also charged with protecting the lives of students, should somebody come in. There are other ways to keep our schools safe. We can talk about entryways, we can talk about exit procedures, we can talk about badging, and not have guns in the school at all. But I don't want our schools to have to have metal detectors and armed guards. I've opposed even having armed guards at my kids' schools because I think it is more dangerous than safety inducing. But those are conversations, but totally separate from arming non-security personnel.
I do not support arming teachers. Very bad idea, as my colleagues have said. I do support security officials that are trained to be armed. I think that's a school board decision, school by school. But I believe that in certain circumstances that could save lives. We saw in Parkland really a pathetic failure by an armed, trained sheriff's deputy, school resource officer, I guess he was called, but he was a deputy sheriff, and he just failed. He just didn't act, and it was horrible. I think he could have saved lives. He would have risked his own. That's why he was there, and it didn't work. And part of the tragedy is I think his life is ruined now. But the principle is sound. I think trained security officials, it's appropriate for them to be armed to protect schools where the school boards want it, but no way should the teachers be armed.
With the gridlock in Washington, I know I've read that individual states are, stepping up, particularly, say, the state of California. So I'm just wondering, with all your enthusiasm, why you would go to Washington, why you think for the last years, even during the Obama administration, we had gridlock, that you three have the talent to overcome that, and why you wouldn't want to either stay, return, or go to Harrisburg and work there and make Pennsylvania more in the forefront of doing what's right.
Well, let me start by quoting Winston Churchill. Never, 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 never give up. So I am not going to sit back with Donald Trump running amok and a dysfunctional Congress, as I mentioned, with blame to go to both party leaders, both sets of party leaders. When this wonderful congressional district is created, I've got the experience and the relationships and the knowledge of politics, and I know how to govern. It's an opportunity for me to give back something, use my skills, and try to make a difference. Is it possible to change Washington? I hope so, because I want to go back there and do it. You just can't let frustration carry the day. Somebody's going to win these elections. Somebody's going to have the power in Washington. Right now, it's the Republicans. I don't like what they're doing, and I'd like to make a change.
It's a good question. I said at the beginning, I've never run for anything before. I've never had anything to run for. Where I live, this is a little awkward, Madeline is my state rep. She's running for state rep. At the time I got into this race, and they will attest, I was the first one in. Madeline was running for something else. So this is the only office I could run for. It's the only office I've ever considered running for. And the only reason I'm considering leaving at the time when the state organization I run has the hottest issue in the nation is because I think I can do more. And I want to see if I can serve in a different way. I don't know if I can fix all the problems. I want to be part of the solution. We need somebody who will fight. That's what I've been doing, and I want to fight more and harder for the issues I care about. So that's the simple truth for me.
I thank you for the question also. And my reason for running is probably connected to November of 2016. As a member of the Pennsylvania House, I love my work, even though I'm beating my head against a wall very often. But as a result of the election of Donald Trump, I felt like I had a choice to sort of hole in and just say, well, I guess there's not a whole lot we can do about this. We're just going to have to hunker down and deal with it and be depressed. Or I can do more. So I have always looked for a place to expand my public service. And I'm guided by a simple parable. So you know the story of the little boy and the starfish. The little boy's walking on a beach early in the morning. There are different versions of this. But this is what I think guides my public service and calls me to do what I'm doing. He's walking on the beach. A high tide has washed up a whole bunch of starfish. And he's throwing them in, one by one. And an older gentleman comes by and says, what are you doing? Well, I'm saving these starfish. I'm saving these starfish. And he said, well, little boy, don't you see, you can't save them all. You can't make a difference. And he picks one up and he says, I made a difference for that one. I made a difference for that one. That's all I think public service is about. One person trying to make a difference for one person, another person, another person. Any of us trying to do that. And cumulatively, we will make a difference. You're doing it by being here, by being engaged. You say that it's worth trying to save one life. If we save one life through a piece of legislation, wasn't that worth it? That's what I'm called to. Expanding my public service to make a difference for more people.
And also, I think we're going to do about 2 more questions. If you could keep your answers somewhat brief. Thank you.
But my question was a little different, and I was curious what your thoughts were on the opioid crisis in our country and its relation, of course, to the gun problems as well, and what thoughts you guys have about doing something when you go to Washington.
I'm glad you raised that. I've noted here that if we didn't raise it, I wanted to say something in my closing remarks. I am working on and care deeply about the opioid crisis. As you know, 64,000 people died of overdose in 2016. 64,000 people. That's 175 people a day. In Pennsylvania, that's 13, 15 people a day dying of overdose. What have I done in the Pennsylvania House? Fought for the passage of what the governor has funded as centers of excellence for outreach to folks who have addiction problems. I've fought for destigmatizing, de-shaming, adding resources for prevention, recovery, and long-term recovery. It's something I care passionately about. I don't know a family that isn't struggling with some version of addiction, some difficulty, and I've seen close up how it racks a person, and then it racks the whole family around them, and then when they die, if they die, how it wrecks a community. Our communities, whether we are rural, urban, suburban, are struggling with this epidemic. I was in Washington, and I'm sorry, I should have been quicker. I was in Washington for a legislators roundtable with this administration, and my own colleagues said, why are you going? It's the Trump administration. I said, because all the more important that we go and make sure our voices are heard. And I asked Mick Mulvaney, what is the president going to do about the opioid crisis? And he said, we're looking at it. We haven't figured out how to put resources toward it. I said, it should be the number one. We should be thinking totally outside the box and putting the resources toward it. Well, the president did declare an emergency around this issue and gave not $1 more. I would go to fight for the resources, to fight to destigmatize, and to get people into recovery.
Thanks. This is a really important issue. Montgomery County's done a good job kind of reducing the toll here with our task force and the work we're doing. We need the money from the state, we need the money from the federal government, we need to destigmatize, decriminalize this behavior, we need to give people pathways to get better, we need to be regulating the docs and the pharmaceutical industry who have created this crisis. And I think we also need to take the lessons, when we look at what's happening now, to other crises we've had. The crack epidemic, we just criminalized that. We didn't treat it. So different communities are affected in different ways, and we treat them differently. And I think we need to hold ourselves accountable as a society, as a government, for what are we doing? Are we waiting until it's communities that look like a lot of this room, or is it communities in the inner city and communities of color, and are we criminalizing and stigmatizing one kind of addiction problem and not another? And we need to look at that. Our criminal justice system shouldn't be a treatment system. We should be treating addiction problems, regardless of where they are and who they have. So we need to do that, but we also need to really, it's a regulatory problem too. We need to hold the pharmaceutical industry responsible, the way they go in and push their prescriptions to doctors, the things that you see on TV. I mean, when I was growing up, not even just when I was growing up, not that long ago, you couldn't watch TV and find a drug that you could then ask your doctor about. It wasn't allowed. That's changes in what the FDA has allowed. When my son got his wisdom teeth out, we got a prescription for Percocet 6 weeks before. When my husband's a doctor, he said, don't you dare fill that. We'll see how he is that day. But what if I had filled it, and somebody else in my house had used it, and then I said I lost the prescription? You can see exactly how this could happen to a family. We need to be tighter on the dots, the pharmaceutical industry, and then we need to be caring for families who are going through this.
I agree with everything my colleagues have just said. Treatment and education is certainly the key that we need to focus on and do a much better job. I would add one example: the mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenders have really hollowed out communities, particularly communities of color. Those mandatory minimums at the federal level should be taken away for nonviolent offenses, and treatment and education take their place.
And this is going to be the last question.
Hi. I just was wondering if you agree with the idea of free tuition at public universities and colleges.
I favor free tuition at community colleges and trade schools. I don't know that we can afford to give free tuition at all universities that are public. Obviously, budgetary considerations are a big part of it. And I would definitely like to work in some free tuition for community service as a way to encourage kids to be able to afford their education and give something back as well. And we certainly ought to have interest-free federal student loans. We should not be using our kids as profit centers for the federal government or the banks.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I really agree with Joe. We do need interest-free loans. We need loan forgiveness for public service, whether, however that's defined, whether that's military service in a VISTA kind of program, service abroad. We need to do that. We need to be also making more affordable other kinds of training and apprenticeship programs for kids who aren't going to go to traditional four-year colleges. We can do more with our community colleges. Right now, we have a Secretary of Education, we talked about her earlier, who favors, helping out loan companies. That's her constituency, not her students, not her parents, not the teachers, the student loan companies. So we need to do something about that. I have a son going off to college. Those forms are scary, they're intimidating. I hear his friends talking about, you're applying for this scholarship, what are you gonna do? This is our future. These are our kids. I mean, it's harder to get these loans paid and forgiven than a mortgage. You need to have college debt forgiveness and bankruptcy, all those kinds of things. I don't know that we can go full four-year public universities free, because what that will do to state budgets, which are already giving less and less to those universities, but some of them have very big endowments, and we should be looking at that and bringing those presidents and provosts in and talking to them about solving this problem that they've helped create, because the tuition goes up way more than anything else we have.
I thank you for the question. I think it's one of the central questions for this county, for Montgomery County and their families. And I told you my number one issue is education. So what I propose, what I believe should happen, is we should have universal pre-K. We know the power of quality early education as it drives a young person into claiming their greater education, K through 12. I believe in free community college. I believe in interest-free student debt. If we were to do that, notice the interconnectedness of education and all of the critical problems that we've been talking about today. If we would do that and dedicate ourselves to educating our children well, we would be walking away and being able to say, we're beginning to solve the opioid crisis. We're beginning to solve how we budget. We're beginning to solve saving lives. So those are the places I care about critically, and I think it's critically important to Montgomery County.
And if anybody has any other questions after the conclusion, if the candidates would like to stay in between the transition from the fourth and fifth candidates, you can go up and ask any questions. Just to close everything up, thank you all for attending and for the great questions. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up now. Please remember to come out and vote at the primaries on May 15th. This is just the beginning, and we will make sure to update everyone on our future events through social media. Make sure you're registered to vote and contact your representatives. You don't need a town hall like this to ask questions or share your ideas. Your representatives always have ways of contacting them through their websites. And like they said, if you would like to join us in the 5th District Candidates Town Hall, that will start at 3. So feel free to grab some lunch or hang around here and rejoin us then. Once again, thank you to all the candidates for joining us, and thank you to all of you for coming out and getting involved.
Hi, good. Hello. Good, I'm sending.